Hi everyone. Eagle Dynamics Chinook CH47F. How does it fly? Or, what I should have maybe called it is, what does Bob have that I don't? All this information is freely available on the internet. So, in this video what I'm going to explain are the basics of how the Chinook flies in the real world compared to DCS. That is, using the current build as of the 23rd of August to see what's modelled correctly and where there's still work to do. These are my own observations. There's plenty more on the forums, Discord channels, etc. So, first of all, a quick overview of the Digital Automatic Flight Control System, DAFCS, which when implemented will make this aircraft much easier to fly, trust me. There are also modes that can be employed using the cyclic and collective that will make all our lives that bit easier. Digital AFCS then, aka DAFCS, similar to the system it replaced a long time ago, provides dampening, attitude hold, bank angle hold, airspeed hold, radar holds, amongst others. It's not a full autopilot in the traditional sense. There's lots to it. Flight control computers, air data computers, it's looking at vehicle velocities, all sorts of inputs and outputs from the system. And yeah, it's incredibly effective at what it does. When it's all working, what we should see, and we do see it to a certain extent already in the model that we've got in DCS, are, for example, the warning and cautions on the MFDs. The control for DAFCS is pretty straightforward, right? So on the canted console, we've got this panel that I'm showing you here. The system itself is essentially a duplex system, which is pretty standard for this kind of thing on aircraft, such that if one system fails, the other is there to take over. When we fly around normally, we have it selected to both. So looking at the switches on the panel, you can see we have the selector switch from off, and then 1 and 2, and then both. And then on the left hand side, this gives us control over the 2 LCTs. These are the longitudinal cyclic trim actuators. They can either move automatically in response to outputs from DAFCS. So for example, they will move depending on whether the wheels are on the ground or forward airspeed moving into the hover and things like that. I'll explain that later on. And we've also got the option, should they have any kind of problem, of selecting them manually so the pilots can actually extend and retract them if there's a problem. Also at the top, in the top left hand corner, there's a flight director button that you can see, and this couples the flight director to the DAFCS for automatic flight control if, that is, a flight director mode is actually selected. This is not currently modelled in game, and whilst we're here, I just want to say, you know, the cockpit does look really good. Flying control wise, essentially the pilot's inputs are via movements of their cyclic, the thrust, aka the collective, and the foot pedals. These movements essentially are transmitted by a collection of rods, bell cranks, integrated lower control actuators, which are ilkers to give it a much needed hydraulic boost, amongst other items. And essentially what they're doing, so they're moving the 2 rotor heads which are upstairs. Now tucked behind here off to left hand side is another item which is going to be important to what we're talking about today. We don't seem to have access to it, but again I'd suggest that Bob does. The item I'm referring to is the DASH. DASH stands for the differential airspeed hold. Basically, it's a long black rod with a couple of actuators on either end, which are essentially they extend and retract according to airspeed and weight on ground signals. As we know then, There's 6 blades on the aircraft, 3 on each head, and the way it turns, it's a contra-rotating aircraft, right? Thus, it's got the benefit of negating the need for a tail rotor and all of the associated transmissions and everything else that you get with a tail rotor as well. However, you know, the alternative in Chinook, to be able to put those 2 rotors on, is a bit of a beast when you look at the transmission drivetrain. In simple terms then, the controls enable us to move such that in the vertical we use the thrust to go up and down, as you can see here, and then in the lateral axis we use the cyclic, so we can push the cyclic backwards and forwards. And again, I'm going to show you how this kind of manifests itself on the aircraft. Pitch up and down is obviously what's going to happen from that. And then when we move the cyclic from side to side in the longitudinal axis, we can roll from left to right and vice versa. Finally, we've got the pedals. These allow us to yaw, but as this is a Chinook, we can actually do that around multiple points. So what's actually happening in each of these movements to the blades, to the rotors, right? Let's take a look at that. So as we can see here, when we pull up on the thrust, we collectively change the pitch of all 6 rotor blades at the same time. And in this case, because we're going to pull the thrust up the way, we start to lift, right? At the same time, the other thing that's happening is that we're actually demanding more power from the engines. And then subsequently, when we push the thrust back down again, it essentially does the opposite, right? So we're collectively, we're changing the pitch, angle of attack. And yeah, all 6 blades are deflected by a similar amount when we're just using the thrust like this, kind of up and down. Nice and straightforward for that one. And as you can see, yeah, that's modelled in game as well. However, not all of it is there yet. And the lack of LCTs are very noticeable. Even before we get there, there's issues with taxiing. And this might be down to how the blades and the heads, should I say, all kind of together, the transmissions or gearboxes, if you like. I'm just going to refer to these by the way when I talk about it as the rotor heads. It may be down to how it's kind of modded or modelled, should I say, in game, right? Because I have seen people commenting about how they're struggling to taxi, or I've seen, for example, people kind of pull the collective a little bit, and it's almost like the aircraft wants to lift up the back end. You know, the back end to be very light, and it's almost like it wants to roll along on the 2 front wheels, which is not very good because you've completely lost, you know, the action of the power steering, which is sat on the back, you know, on the aft right hand wheel. So obviously that's not going to work, right? So what we've got in reality is that on the real aircraft is that the transmissions are actually tilted forwards, right? They've done this, you know, this is for years of engineering and testing and everything else, because without that it would actually struggle to ground taxi. But because we've got that, it does mean that when we lift into the hover, because the transmissions are tilted forward and subsequently the rotor heads are naturally tilted slightly forwards as well, means that when you lift into the hover, the aircraft just wants to start moving forwards, right? Which is not ideal. You know, you could be on the back of an aircraft carrier or a confined area or something like that. You want to be able to move this aircraft into the hover without, you know, ideally kind of like straight into sort of fighting it or whatever. And we do, certainly I notice this quite a lot in DCS. I've seen CH47 like driver, he's commented on the same kind of thing. You lift into the hover, even when you do, okay, you might have forgotten to turn AFCS on, But even then, you're still having to kind of, do a bit too much work, I'd suggest, than when DAFCS is actually here. The other thing that we've got on the real aircraft are the LCTs, and essentially when the aircraft senses that it's taken off, right, so weight on wheel switch, what they'll do is they'll start to retract, and upstairs it means that those rotor heads that were both kind of tilted forwards, they'll basically tilt them such that you're going to assist the aircraft and the pilot to maintain a nice sort of steady hover, right? So with essentially DAFCS assisting that, so that's the one that's the system that's sending out these signals, you should find that your hovering and everything else should be rock solid when that's fully implemented. Bob, our AI helper, seems to have LCTs, I'd suggest, from what I've seen when I kind of activate him, but we don't. Next then, and again, I'm kind of keeping this top level, right? If we stay in the hover and then we grab hold of the cyclic and we move it to the left, what you should notice then is the aircraft cabin kind of might tilt slightly to the left, and essentially you're basically just going to crab along to the left hand side, right? So it's pretty kind of sort of standard helicopter technique, right? No forward or aft speed, so again, useful if perhaps we're manoeuvring on top of a load or something like that. And sure enough, when we return the cyclic back to the middle, the aircraft levels out. So the DCS, yeah, it's got that. You can see how it's both like the heads and everything are moving together. So essentially that's what's happening upstairs. Is both rotor heads are being tilted either to the left or the right by an equal amount as you're kind of crabbing across. But yeah, you're still having to fight it a little bit. Certainly in my experience, and that's even with adding trim and things like that. So back into the hover then. If we operate the foot pedals, we firstly, and as I said before, it's not the only place we'll yaw around the natural axis. So in other words, the middle of the cab, right? So what happens is that if, for example, we're on a yaw to the left, we press the left pedal. What's going on upstairs with the rotor heads is actually, and we can see here it's modelled in game, which is really cool. You can see that the forward head will tilt to the left and the aft rotor head tilts to the right, and hopefully you can kind of see from that how basically it kind of drags itself around to the left. And essentially the more you press that pedal, the faster you're going to go round, right? And then obviously if you press the right, it works in the opposite sense. And yeah, that side of things does seem to be modelled pretty well. Now what we want to do is transition into forward flight, or maybe you want to go backwards, but we'll stick with going forwards, right? So we gain some height and we move the cyclic forwards. What this is actually doing then to our rotor heads upstairs is that we're using something called differential collective pitch. And this is actually another reason why I know kind of US Army in particular, they're very keen on calling the thrust lever, because it's like you can't call it the collective because the cyclic also impacts not quite the same way, but it's all kind of collectively doing something to the rotor heads. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of terminology from a UK perspective. We still call it the collective, but everyone kind of recognises the different channels and what it does, right? So that's just a different kind of terminology there. So yeah, we have differential collective pitch, and essentially what's happening in this instance, because we want to go forwards, is we're going to and tilt forwards is we're going to decrease lift on the forward rotor and increase it on the aft, or the opposite if we're flying backwards, right? The result of which, and you can see on the screen then, is that first of all the aircraft knows it's going to drop, but then as it does so, the airspeed is going to increase. Now, again, I've kind of kept it quite basic because we're just concentrating at one control at a time. You would also be, monitoring what's going on with the collective as well, especially, for example, if you've left a runway or something like that and you're starting to accelerate and kind of gain some altitude as well. So this mostly works in game, but you certainly do have to be aware of what's going on at all times. Now, what should happen, and certainly does happen on the real aircraft, after around 40 knots there or thereabouts, is that those LCTs that I was talking about before, they actually start motoring. So it's DAFCS that's going to tell them to motor. It's basically looking and saying, hey, yeah, we're moving forwards, we're no longer hovering, we can't have them sat in like a ground position or anything like that. They need to move into a flight position, so they get a signal to start motoring forward. And what this is going to help us achieve, and this is definitely a problem or something that I've noticed about the DCS version, is that with LCTs going, when you're basically cruising along doing like 120 knots in the DCS version, your nose is probably still pointing somewhere towards the ground, almost like, kind of similar to the Huey I've got and things like that. In reality, with the LCTs working, they tilt the rotor heads forward, and it actually means that the cabin, or the airframe, should I say, if you look at a real aircraft as it's flying along at those kind of speeds, it's level. Yeah, and they're doing it for a reason, right? If the nose was tilted down the whole way, it'd be a tremendous amount of drag. You think of all the fuel that you're going to burn through. They also have problems with blade flapping and things like that. So, yeah, you can see, as I'm showing you there, this is essentially what an aircraft should look like when it's sort of travelling at speed. Also, after, again, this kind of 40 knot regime, and the reason they say that is kind of below that is sort of considered like the kind of almost like the hover sort of regime. So beyond that then, you should also have absolutely no need for the foot pedals. You might rest your feet on them or something like that, and by all means go speak to a pilot, right, who flies Chinook, especially DAFCS. Some of them might just rest their feet on it. Some of them will just fly with their feet flat on the floor, right? However, that doesn't happen in the DCS model at present, right? Because you certainly do have to keep kind of nudging in a little bit of yaw, and yeah, I mean, you can kind of get used to it, but in a way I'd suggest don't get used to it, because when they fix it, and you're traveling at speed, you're just not going to need them at all, right? And again, this is something that Bob seems to have, but we don't. So it kind of suggests, there are some fixes out there, but they are going to kind of filter down to us, right? So now then, again in forward flight, we're kind of up to speed. Now we're going back to cyclic, right? And when we're in the hover before, if we moved it to the left, we'd crab across to the left. In reality, what should happen is that essentially, the left and right heads similarly are both deflected to the same side by similar amounts to enable the aircraft to go into a roll, and subsequently you can do a coordinated turn similar to flying a conventional aircraft. In the current module in DCS then, you do have to put in some pedals, and this is something on the Miltech version of the D model I found really bad on that first one, because you could be going 120 knots or something like that, and you could just move the cyclic to the left, and it's just as if you kind of side slipped out of the sky and into the ground. Bob, once again, has got this fixed, right? Which again kind of suggests that they have got a good idea what the full DAFCS is going to look like. Now, what about this thing called the dash then? So to quote the US Army Operator Manual, which I've actually linked in the description, the pitch, attitude, stability, airspeed, hold and positive stick gradient from hover through to Vmax are provided through the dash actuator. Well, we certainly don't have it in game yet, but Bob's got it. In a basic sense then, what does it do? So imagine a situation where we've lifted off, we're accelerating off to say 130 knots, something like that. And, we want to be cruising for quite a while. Let's say it's just a straight kind of A to B. As we accelerate then, if we haven't got the dash in place, what we're kind of doing essentially is pretty much you pushing the stick forward, and nose is going down. This is certainly how we've got it in DCS, and you're trimming, and then you put it back to middle, and then you're probably pushing it a bit kind of forward again, right? So this is certainly not ideal. I mean, worst case scenario, I guess if you're not kind of trimming or something like that, you might almost, but yeah, be a bit excessive, kind of pushing, almost as if you're pushing the stick into the instrument panel or something like that. But I imagine, yeah, especially with HOTAS and things like that, you're not going to be there. But you want your controls to be in a far more kind of natural position, and this is what the dash essentially allows for, or one of the things it allows for on the real aircraft, right? And yeah, it enables what it's talking about there, this positive stick gradient. So something else that will give you a bit of a clue as to what's going on with it, and again why things are not quite there just yet with the DCS version, is if you look down, if you're sat in the captain's seat in the right hand side and you look down to the left as if you're looking past your left knee. I mean, I play in like VR. You got the right hand side of the canter console, and you'll see what is actually like a glass tube with a red indicator, right? So that red indicator is actually connected to it's pretty much like a cable. It's like a tube, right, that links up to the flying controls. And this indicator, so it's the LPI, and yeah, in reality, you wouldn't be moving it that far forward from neutral. Again, we've got all the other options, which again DAFCS has not afforded us just yet. So you could only perhaps have it maybe an inch, couple of inches forwards or something like that. And if you looked up at the instruments and outside, you could be rattling along at 120 knots or something like that. So that's certainly why we need it to enable the aircraft to fly correctly in forward flight for sure. Finally, just go back to something that I was talking about earlier in respect to yawing the aircraft around. Now, yes, you can if you just kind of lift up and press the pedals, and I was talking about before how the rotor heads, the forward and aft rotor heads, are going to move in opposition by equal amounts, right? So yes, we can move around the natural position in the middle, but then if we combine that with moving the cyclic stick, what we can actually do is we can rotate around the forward head, and it can be a bit trickier to do, certainly. You can actually rotate and yaw around the aft head as well. So it gives you, again, more kind of capabilities to move this larger aircraft around, especially if you're in tight situation. Perhaps, I don't know, you're trying to get some cargo onto the back of a ship or something like that. if you want to see how the aircraft is really put through its paces, right? I can't recommend it enough. If you ever go to UK air show, they do the occasional kind of air shows in Europe and things like that. But if you can, or if you can't see it in person, go on YouTube and have a look at the RF Odin Chinook display team videos. They really put this aircraft through its paces, right? Especially some of the ones from a few years ago, because whilst the current display is pretty good, quite a few years ago they certainly put the aircraft kind of through its paces. But one of the things that they will say is they're not kind of chucking around for airshows' sake necessarily. They are also demonstrating with quick stops and all this kind of stuff what the aircraft is capable of should we require it, in whatever scenario. So, some of the issues I've encountered with the current DCS model, these, as I've explained here, these have been rectified by DAFCS, but also a combination of things, right? So not just the AFCS, which came before DAFCS, but also structural changes as well. So the addition of things like strakes, it's the reason why I've got a blunted aft pylon and things like that. So all this was kind of rectified a long time ago in the real world. And the kind of things they worked on, and some of the things that I kind of still see is such as preventing the nose, like we said quite a lot, from wanting to dip towards the ground all the time, and the pilot essentially being in a situation where they're accelerating forwards and the cyclic is actually back the way, so it's kind of working in the opposite sense. That recognizing the fact that the faster you go, like the rear blades are generating more lift than the front, and you get in a situation where the back wants to overtake the front. Again, I've definitely seen that in DCS, and in the real world they kind of fix that with modifications to the airframe and DAFCS as well. And then other things. There's a lot of, I suppose, if you'd kind of describe it as like quality of life kind of stuff. So for example, just being able to put the aircraft, like push the cyclic forward, get it into a nice kind of airspeed, nice sort of acceleration that you'd like, push the CDR switch, set the controls in position, and then kind of off you go, especially if you're doing like a straightforward kind of A to B sort of situation. I know we have got a basic sort of trim that's there, but again, from my perspective, I don't kind of find it that effective, to be honest. Anyway, I'm sure all of this is going to be addressed over time by the Eagle Dynamics team, who they've produced a great model. I'm going to talk kind of at a different time about how the model actually looks, because I kind of go around it, I'm like, oh my god, it's got this here, and people that are discovering that not only can you go to the Crew 6 position and look at things like the maintenance panel, but look down at the centre hatch when it's open and things like that. I was reading about some guy that managed to use Bob to pick up a load whilst they're in VR looking through the centre hatch, which is amazing. Right, you wouldn't be able to do that without Bob, trust me. You'd be a flaming great big wreck or whatever, but with Bob, that sounds pretty cool, right? And I'm confident that the Chinook in DCS is going to go from strength to strength, that's for sure. So hopefully you've found this short-ish kind of video informative. Is there anything else you'd like to add? I suppose a bit of a disclaimer, I did want to keep it top level from this one, so please don't kind of hammer me for not saying, oh, you didn't say how many degrees forward the transmissions are tilted, and pressures and temperatures and all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, you can go read that, right? Certainly that information is available. I just wanted to keep it quite sort of light, especially for those that are not kind of familiar with how Chinook operates. Anyway, have a good one. Laters. Cheerio.